Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today for how to write an IT disaster recovery plan. My name's James Watts. I'm here today with Chris Butler, who is our Resilience Director. He's going to be presenting the session. Before I hand over, I'll run through a couple of quick bits of housekeeping to get us started. Now, the first thing to say is we are recording this session. We will send it out to everybody afterwards, along with the slides, as well as some of the handouts that you can probably see on the right-hand side. Now, we're going to have a handful of different resources that we talk about during this session that we've put together over the years to kind of help building an IT disaster recovery plan. Some of these are documents. They're in the handout section, but we also have some online tools, links to all of them you can find on our website, but we will include with everything after the session. And the other thing to say is, if you've ever been on any of our webinars in the past, we're usually absolute sticklers for time, and we'll say we'll keep rigidly to 30 minutes, including Q&A. Now, we've already had a lot of really good questions from everyone with the registrations. So we're going to push that a little bit. We're going to be 30 minutes today for the content of the session, and then we're going to do 10-15 minutes, however long, of the Q&A afterwards. Again, if you can't stick around for the full length, then don't worry, we'll have that recorded. And something that we do always say is, please do, if you have any questions, do type them in the panel on the right-hand side. If there's anything that we actually don't have time to or are able to get to, we always make sure we'll get back to you individually and make sure everything is answered. And we've had some really good ones so far. And as a very quick note before I hand over to Chris on this point, is it's a big topic. An IT disaster recovery plan, and we've got a real wide range of attendees in the session today. So we've got, looking through the kinds of questions that we received, there's some really detailed ones from people who are ITDR or BC managers as their entire role, and then there's questions from other people who, you know, this is just one part of a wider role they have. So we're going to do our best to cover all those bases and hopefully be useful for everyone on the session today. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Chris.
Brilliant, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Lovely to have so much interest in this webinar. But without further ado, let's get cracking on. In fact, James, would you like to launch our first poll? We're going to get some early audience engagement to warm you up, just a little bit. So you can just choose from these. So select the ones that you think are the top 3 business risks for 2023. There's some really interesting surveys and studies that are out there every year from the World Economic Forum, Aviva, Alliance, and others, who all analyze the risk environment. So just quickly click on the ones that you think are the top three out of those 5 risks, and as soon as we've got the results, we'll move on. There's it's obviously a very tricky risk landscape at the moment, and IT disaster recovery is front and center of a lot of that in many in most organizations, both in this country but across Europe and you know and the West as well.
Right.
How are we doing, James?
Yeah, let me close this off and I'll see if I can share the answers there. So this was the response.
There we go. What have we got first? Cyber, followed by business interruption, followed by legal and regulatory challenges. Well, the Alliance risk barometer for this year identified that the first highest UK risk, or risk for UK businesses, is indeed cyber. That would come as any surprise to you. Secondly, it was business interruptions, so you've all read that report. And the third one would be around macroeconomic developments as well. But I think you'll all very much understand that IT disaster recovery is central to responding to things like cyber, and also for things like business interruption. So with that in mind, let's now think about what actually disaster recovery means. How does this fit into a business? So what I'm doing here is going to show you how our vision for what business resilience is. And effectively, in an organization, you've got the executive team, and they've got to provide the leadership, set the strategy and the vision for what the company, the organization, is trying to do. That is then turned into goods, products and services by the operations team, and they meet the strategy, clearly having to use good, profitable techniques in order to do that. That's then in turn supported by the technology teams, whose job is to focus on making sure that the systems and services and data are available. You've got working around on uptime, on availability, and security, of course, of the data and the information systems that are being used by the operations team. And of course, your supply chain then covers everything in an organization, from catering and physical security, all the way through to perhaps if you've got managed service providers, particularly the big global cloud providers, for example. So it's a really strong and important ecosystem that has to work together in order to be profitable. And then in a disruption, what you're then expecting to see from these various different teams is dynamic leadership, adaptive operations, good, robust, reliable technology, and very supportive networks. So using business continuity is the traditional way of looking after your operations, and IT disaster recovery to look after your technology are both part of what has to be an integrated approach to business resilience. You can't think of ITDR in a stovepipe. You have to make sure they're integrated, and we call this being resilient by design. So with that sort of context of how this fits into an organization, I want to move on now to consider the closer interaction between IT disaster recovery and business continuity. And we use this Brighton rock analogy, if you'd forgive us. And it shows us a really good and useful depiction of the relationship. ITDR is fundamentally central to and runs completely through your business continuity plan. And depending on how much your business relies on IT, that might make it a small part or indeed the vast majority of your response and your BC arrangements. ITDR is clearly about bringing your systems back online following a technology disaster. Business continuity is everything else. It's about your people, your premises, your suppliers, and more. You can have, of course, BC issues that don't touch your IT, like your office is out of action because of a terrorist threat in London, or the pandemic is another good example. But I suppose I ought to highlight here that recovery from a sophisticated cyber attack may require a different approach, bearing in mind in that circumstance, your data may be encrypted, even if you've got access to some of your systems, but you won't know where your last clean recovery point is. But we're not going to go into that today. That's for a different subject. But bear in mind that actually sometimes you need a different use case for a complex cyber attack. So really, let's get on to what the important subject and why we're here today is to look at how you go through writing and producing an ITDR plan. These are all the components that you need to get you to that workable tested state, and they are aligned with how you run a business continuity or a wider business resilience approach in your business. And it's a theme of today that these things do go hand in hand. You can't stovepipe them. The writing of the plan is in many ways just one small part. It's 1/8 of these 8 steps here, and you can't dive into writing the plans until you've agreed everything else that sits around it. And the first 3 steps here, you can see, should be aligned with what you do for business continuity. So work out what your policy is, what you're trying to achieve, why you're doing it, who's responsible, and all the various teams involved. You need to analyze the business, which identifies what your important business services are. BC used to take a sort of a process approach. We've very much moved on now to think about what's important to the business, what the essential outcomes are that you're trying to achieve, and what the impacts to the business are if they are disrupted. And then you work out the risks to those important business services. You've got to prioritize them clearly. And now at this point, having done that business analysis, you move into the technology space, which is where you identify, assess, and understand the critical IT services that are used by the teams to deliver your important business services. But of course, you've got to do this quite carefully. You need to run the rule over what your business teams think they need. Anyone who's done a BIA will be familiar with the fact that everyone thinks that their system is the most important one in the business and it needs to be back up and running within 1 hour. That's clearly not true. You need to prioritize according to the business needs. So those first 4 stages, 1 through to 4, represent the planning stage of producing your ITDR plan. Then you've got to get into working out what you do. And this is where you design and implement your mitigation strategies. These are technological solutions, but it's just one part of this overall approach. And these strategies should also be prioritized according to the risks and impacts you've identified. And once you've done that, you can then work out your plans, which is how you implement the strategies to meet the requirements of the business. It's less about the what you use to recover and more about the how you do that. This includes writing the detailed run books, and we'll talk about this a bit later on. So that's really the enacting of the ITDR plan, or the implementation, if you like. And then clearly, we're into the testing and maintenance. And the point of testing is to check that everything works. Learn the lessons in a controlled environment rather than when you're in the heat of the battle, because that's never the best time to find out that your plan doesn't work. If you don't test your plans, you won't know that they work. And then you've clearly also got to keep them up to date. Business changes, and therefore plans need to change with them. So that's then the final testing and maintenance phase. It might look like quite a long list, but it has to reflect how your business works, and it has to be consistent with everything else in the business. As I say, I'm stressing the need for coherence here. So who is it that you're looking at to get involved here? Who's responsible for keeping the business going, and who's responsible for IT? This is one of the downloads that's available for you, so don't worry about all the detail. You can get that from either the website or the handouts pane. Nobody is expecting somebody in IT admin to be able to recover the business in 15 minutes all by themselves. But also, we need to get the finance team to be able to provide the budget to deliver IT, and therefore you need this approach that identifies the cost benefit to the various solutions. You need to decide what you need to spend on recovery. That again is based on the risks. So what are the costs against the business requirements? And the CEO might, him or herself, be too far away from the nuts and bolts of IT to really be able to judge it. So this balance is what's important. So overall ownership of disaster recovery does need to sit with a senior member of the IT leadership team, but this has to be integrated alongside risk functions, assurance, business continuity, and crisis management. And then when it comes to the response in the actual time of the disruption, the ITDR team has also to work in coordination with the BC team, who's keeping the business going, possibly the cyber response team if it's a cyber incident and you're looking to recover from that, and of course the crisis management team from the executive leadership level. But at the end of the day, it's IT who understands what it takes to keep the lights on in a business. So the next step then is to understand what the business looks like and what it needs. And we always, in business continuity, look at the BIA and the risk assessment together. They are important, and they do need to do these first. The risk assessment is just that. It's an assessment of all of your risks. You make a list and you brainstorm that with the right people from the business, and this starts to form your risk register. We like to score all risks, and there's a variety of opinions as whether you do a 3x3 or a 5x5 or an even bigger grid. But here we've scored everything between 1 to 5 for probability or likelihood, and the same for impact or severity. Again, choose the language that you prefer. The higher the number, the more serious the type of risk. But you should also think through what your current mitigation measures are, and you need to identify how that reduces your risk. This gives you a net risk score, which you then allows you to then populate a risk matrix, and these graphical representations are a really good way of being able to view in an easily understandable and digestible way what your highest risks are. So obviously you're going to have low impact, high likelihood, and also very likely and low impact, and the ones that you're perhaps not bothered about are those in the bottom left of that grid there. So anything that's 1, 1, 2, 2. So those aren't the things where you need to focus your attempts. But if your office sits in a floodplain, you might find that a flood risk sits in the sort of the 5-5 or 4-5 sort of area. And equally, cyber is likely to feature prominently as well. So that's where you focus your attempts on, and that's what you're prioritizing. And then having done all that with your risks, you're then looking at the BIA process to evaluate the impacts of any of these risks if they were to come to play as an incident on the important business services. So we are again stressing here, thinking services and activities, not processes. This is important because there's no point spending tens, hundreds, thousands or millions of pounds on high cost disaster recovery if the impact on the business doesn't really warrant it. So an essential output of the BIA is a list of the critical IT services needed to deliver your important business services by department in the organization. So let's take an example, which we'll work through. Your account management team may well use a CRM, a customer relations management system. And if this system is unavailable for longer than, for example, 12 hours, the business impact reaches high. So this really is then your start point for the next phase. And this is really important and starts to get to the heart of your DR plan. And it gets more complex the larger your organization is. And historically, an ITDR, often people think really from the infrastructure recovery side first. How long will it take me to recover server X? But actually, what you need to really do is come at this from the business function side first. What is the business function that we're trying to keep going? And this is why we start the BIA. Oh, apologies. There we go. Get that running. So we start the BIA and think about the account management team. What you'll have is your primary CRM application that I mentioned, and this is a sort of a tool that we've got that is part of the downloads from the website that can help users. This team uses this tool to speak to customers and access account details. Your BIA has told you that you need to get that team operational again inside 12 hours, and this is your recovery time objective. And then there'll be an associated recovery point objective for the data as well. What do you need to do in the plan then to ensure that your CRM application is operational within that 12 hours time frame? What networking or assets or servers or storage, security, firewalls, and other services make up the ability to maintain that application for that business critical application, indeed for the account management team? Once you start to map out services in this way, everything becomes a bit easier because you're starting to understand the relationship between the components, the critical service, and the business. And it makes conversations between IT and departmental heads much easier. It's less of an IT issue at this point and more of a business issue. And this tool is a useful way. You can use this, or you'll have other versions of it, and you can get this information from your BIA or a CMDB or an asset register. What you're really after then is the analysis of what's critical and therefore what you should prioritize. But then you can take that and visualize what those IT asset dependencies look like. And again, we can run this through here so you can just get an idea for how this particular tool works. As I say, it's a free download on the website, and I think it's in the handouts page. What you then need to be able to do is to visualize what recovery objectives you will have per asset, and you've got sort of the components on the left, and then in black on the right, you've then got the particular platforms or critical business services that you're managing. This does work well, perhaps for the smaller type of organization. For a larger, more complex organization, it might start to get a little bit messy. But at the end of the day, you can do this using a spreadsheet if you needed to, and other types of tools are out there. So once you've identified all of that, what you're then doing is working out what the strategies are that you need in order to keep the business going. You know what the risks are, you know the impacts, and you know how IT is supporting your critical business functions. This means that when you make a decision about the best backup and replication technology for you, it's all servicing that goal. But you can't jump straight into this point, as you won't know what it is you're trying to achieve. And you might end up spending loads of money on DR when you don't need to, as I indicated earlier. So this is where understanding these risks, impacts, and so on allow you to get the balance between your backup and DR solutions right. And this is just an example of a framework for a backup service, and represents what we would provide our customers. But you won't end up spending unnecessarily if you don't need immediate failover for all systems, and nobody does. And those instances where you need something like a DR into Azure environment, like this one that you're seeing there, will probably be the things you need to think of for your really highest priority assets. But it's not as perfect, it's not as black and white as this, or it doesn't quite work as perfectly as this, if you like, in the real world. You're always coming back to that cost benefit discussion that I mentioned earlier. You can't have high availability for everything. It's probably too expensive for most companies. But what you'll end up doing is having your technology teams under your CTO, perhaps, going into the market, seeing what the options are, and giving you sort of think of it like a gold, silver, and bronze. Gold might be high availability for everything at £1 million a year, for example. Silver, gives you a 4-hour RTO, but costs £250,000. And bronze could be backup recovery, and that would take you days, but would only cost you £100,000. What's appropriate for your business? That's really the question when it comes to understanding what your mitigation strategies are going to be. And once you've got that, now we can finally get into actually writing the plans. So we're quite a way through this presentation, and now we're talking about writing the plans, and that is an important point, that you can't jump into it, and I've stressed that a couple of times. Hopefully you can see why that is. So the advice that we'd offer here is you've got to be pretty prescriptive when you're writing these plans. You're not necessarily writing them for yourself. And actually, you might not even be writing them for your A team. And if on the day of the races, your A team in IT terms is there, they will hopefully have a good idea of what they're doing. They're there and they're able to get stuck into the problem solving straight away. But actually, you're writing the plans to make sure you've got everything recorded for those who perhaps don't know the system so well. For example, you need to start recovery at a weekend or overnight. If the A team's not around, who is doing that recovery? So that's part of establishing the plans in the first place. You need to lay out all of your assumptions and all the steps that you'd follow. For example, you may know, or somebody in the IT team will know, that following the restore of the server, you need to reboot it. But if that's not clear to somebody who doesn't know the system, that needs to be encapsulated in the plan. Be specific about the kinds of commands that you need, especially when you get down into the sort of the run books. And if you need additional detail in the plan, you need to identify where this could be found, but bear in mind that information for things like, for example, encryption keys needs to be securely handled so that it is not easily accessible to people who shouldn't have that information. So you need to make sure you've got all the additional detail. You should include a range of different scenarios in your plan to match the key instance that you've experienced or would expect. But in business continuity terms, there's an adage that you plan for impacts and not for scenarios, which means that you don't have 100 plans for 100 different types of things that could go wrong. You're better off grouping them into a much smaller number of impacts that they would have. So, a number of different trigger points could lead to certain impacts on the business, and that's what you're recovering from. So group it that way, and then have the respective run books associated with those lots of impacts. So, the cause of a particular incident could be multiple, but the impact on the business is the same. But there are clearly some differences. For example, if you're trying to, recover from a SAN failure, that's different to recovering from a cyber attack or a ransomware, in particular, a ransomware attack. So those are two examples where you will have plans specifically for each, and in particular for ransomware recovery. When you lay out your plans, you should also lay out your expectations and what the escalation stages are, and when you should or shouldn't invoke the plan. Clearly, you're not doing ITDR for something that your incident management team or your problem ticket management team can do, but equally, there are certain instances where you definitely want to invoke the plan, even if you de-escalate shortly afterwards. And the reason for this is multiple, but the main one being that your BIA will determine your RTOs for your business services. And if you've got an RTO of 4 hours, but your IT analysis tells you that it takes 3 hours to recover the associated system, you actually have to start your recovery after 1 hour of downtime. Does your plan enable that? Sometimes people think that actually, I can just get stuck into problem solving here. I'll fix this in 15 minutes. But what happens if you can't or you don't? You might be right. It might be a simple fix. But if it's not, that 15 minutes can become an hour, can become 2 hours. And before long, you found out that the issue you're facing is much more significant. And at that point, you invoke DR. But you're then 3 hours behind the drag curve, and the business departments won't be getting won't be back up and running in time, certainly not in time with the plans that you've come up with. Bottom line is, of course, the business units, they just want their critical services back. That's all they're interested in. So a good plan would recognize these business requirements and ensure that the recovery actions are aligned and integrated so that expectations are managed and that the right resources are there in order to meet those business priorities. But of course, behind that, sorry, there we go. The easiest way for everything to fall apart during a disaster is to have poor communications. You could argue that a disaster that goes badly wrong but is well communicated might leave you in a better place than a well-managed one and one that's been badly communicated. We're not going to talk on external comms today. That's really for BC, the BC team, but we'll look really at the internal communications when dealing with the disaster. There are several audiences you need to consider. You've got to think about the executive team, and depending on the severity and the impact of the disruption that you're facing, you're likely to have your crisis management team up and running. And if you've experienced a cyber attack, you can guarantee it. They'll be leading the overall response across the business. And one of their core functions is this external communications. You won't be doing that from the ITDR team, but the information that you have will be feeding that communications team. You've then got internal communications more broadly. Not every employee would be affected by every disruption. So you need to be able to tell them what's happened, if there are any restrictions or downtime as a result of the disruption outside of the core affected teams. You might need staff to log in, log off, or shut down services. And you do this in coordination with the BC team and quite possibly the cyber response team. Again, coordination is a key theme here. It's much easier than it was a few years ago because we've got more tools at our disposal to do this. You could use Teams or Slack as long as they're available. You know, we have dealt with cyber attacks with some of our customers that do span both on-premise IT and Microsoft 365, so Teams might not work. And of course, those are business services, and not everyone will be picking up messages out of hours in the night or at the weekends. WhatsApp is another common tool. Again, some considerations here. It's okay for small groups dealing with an incident, but for large organizations, it's pretty horrific to manage and to be able to stay on top of incidents just the way it works. And we've heard of companies that notified staff of an incident via WhatsApp and inadvertently told a load of ex-staff who left the company, moved on, and were working with competitors. So, I mean, you saw this briefly, I think. You got the old-fashioned call tree. Nothing wrong with that. For small teams, these still work. Get somebody on the phone. But for the larger organizations, really what you're after is some form of central number where people can dial in and find the latest information, and that will be managed by, again, the crisis communications team. You've also, for the really large organizations, you've got tools such as Everbridge or F24 that could also manage all that notification and communications. All this, of course, has to be included in your plans as well. The communications is a really important part of it. So getting to the last stage then, thinking about the testing is very boring. We all know it, but testing is really important. So, James, can we launch the second and last of the two polls that we've got for the audience? Thank you. And the question is, popping up here now, how many organizations conduct annual ITDR tests? Choose one. You've got 4 options there. And click go, and we'll have a look at the results of that in just a moment.
Coming in, that's interesting. Okay, I'll give you one more minute, and then I'll close this one off, and we can share.
Brilliant.
Right, there we go. Okay, closing this poll off now and sharing the results.
22%. Goodness me, you're a pessimistic bunch. Well, I can tell you from our data health check survey, which we last completed in 2022, the results of that one was that 54% said that they had tested in the last year. Relatively speaking, it's getting better because it was 39% in 2014. It is improving, but actually 54% is still only half of organizations. And maybe you as the audience are reflecting what you've experienced in your companies. Thanks, James. I'm going to go back to the slides. There we go. Perfect. Thank you. And these tests are easy to put off because of other priorities and demands. But you've got to, if you've done a test this year, dear audience, well done. Pat in the back. But of course, testing is important in a number of ways. If you're, just by way of an aside, if you're renewing cyber insurance policies, you'll find that the insurers there have got tougher on the questions that they're asking companies. And they will be asking about all of your plans, including business continuity, disaster recovery, and cyber response. And they have, in our experience, started asking when you last tested those plans and even the results of those tests and what you've done about them. It can have an impact on what you pay or whether you get any insurance coverage at all. Anyway, that aside, you're testing to find out if your plans work. We tend to exercise business continuity plans because you're exercising the arrangements that you have, but you do test a DR plan because you're testing to see whether you've recovered server X and service Y. And not only did you successfully recover the service, did you do so within the time that the business needs? So it's still a fail if your RTO is 4 hours, but it took you 6 hours. Failure, however, is not a problem as long as you then fix the problem that you've identified, and that's the importance behind testing. Have problems, but solve the problems, retest, and then make sure that your arrangements are there and ready for when you actually need to use them. We're almost done. I just see we've hit past. We're almost there. And then finally, this graphic is another one of the ones that's available to you in the download. You know, you never actually finish writing a plan, along with all of your other business resilience plans. These things are always working documents. You know, your IT constantly changes. You might be going through a big transformation. Your recovery plans have to adapt along with any other changes in the business. This is why you need clear ownership of your plans, because that person has to be on top of updates, approvals, testing, learning, and improving. And when you establish the roles and responsibilities back in step 1, if you recall, you know, include a RACI and ensure that updates and maintenance is included as well. And you know, you have to think of that in terms of your third-party supply chain as well. You know, for us, you know, for our data barracks customers, for example, if they have any changes in their environment, they notify us, and then we review to see whether it has an effect on our ability to recover their services that we're looking after. So there we go. You're always constantly making changes. You're testing, reviewing, and updating. So there we go, almost at the end. I'm going to remind you of what we've talked about in the last 30 minutes. You know, we're talking about how to write a DR plan. These are the steps that you need to follow to produce this, you know, best-in-class, first-class ITDR plan. Set the policy, pick the teams, carry out the BIA, and these are your, effectively, this is all your planning phase. You then go through establishing the various mitigation strategies and writing the plans. That's the enacting or enabling stage. And you've got to test and update them as well. This is the maintenance phase, if you like. Putting pen to paper is one small part of that. You've got a lot to do in order to get a really good ITDR plan. So that's what we've gone through today. I hope you found that interesting and useful. We're about to move into questions for those who are still able, and as well as looking at the ones that are pre-submitted. My final thing here is these are some of the resources that are in the handouts, which will be available on the slides. Some of those provide you links to what's on our website as well, which you can download there from the website. But a lot of those things are now available, and they're all, you know, free downloads. For those of you who'd like to take advantage of those. So, James, I think with that in mind, I will pause, sip a glass of water, a mouthful of water, and then we can move on to questions.
Very good, thank you. And in fact, yeah, we've had a lot of really good questions through. And while you're catching your breath and getting a drink, I'll just see if I can answer a couple of the first ones. So one, which is hopefully a quick and easy question. So for a non-techie, can you tell us what a runbook is? So hopefully we cover that a little bit. It's very much the specific steps that you take to recover a particular system. So we've got in one of the handouts is a kind of template runbook. May have several runbooks. It's the sort of, you know, within an ITDR plan, it's the specific steps that you're walking through. So it's the kind of document that your IT team will use to work through recovery. Hopefully your IT team know what that is. Yeah, but good question for checking on the terminology for a non-techie. Another question. This was a question that we had prior to starting the webinar, and it was an interesting one. It was, how does an on-premises and a cloud recovery differ, brackets, or doesn't it? Now this is interesting because we've actually had a couple of additional questions that are sort of on this topic further on, and there's a short answer and a long answer. And I think the short answer, particularly within the context of this webinar, is it really doesn't. All of the steps that Chris has walked through, obviously there's, you know, those eight steps don't matter to, you know, they work regardless of whether you're talking about an on-premises or a cloud recovery. Obviously, the specifics of how you recover those systems are different. Now, the two questions that we've had today are kind of far more specific. So the first question we had is, I'll see if I can dig out the actual wording of this because it is interesting. So with the wider usage of cloud and high availability, geodiverse data centers, we're finding our technology suppliers focus more on SLAs and no longer give us an RTC, so recovery time capability. Are these still relevant anymore? Now that's interesting because, yeah, I think probably that is more common, particularly when you're looking at public cloud providers where, you know, you'll have an SLA for storage uptime, you'll have an SLA for EC2 uptime, for instance, and all of those things you can build and then increase your kind of your overall resilience. If you choose to operate multi-availability zone or across regions. Now, that service provider themselves won't tend to give you say a recovery time capability. They don't tend to talk in those terms, but that's not to say that you can't deliver that. You can still provide and still meet an SLA to the organization of a recovery time objective and a recovery point objective, for instance. But it tends to be something that either needs to be done by yourself or through a service provider, rather than something that's delivered by those cloud providers. Now, very interestingly, literally the next question that we got, I think probably from two completely different organizations, but just on such a kind of interesting similar point, was now that SaaS such as M365 are becoming more prevalent in organizations, how do you think this is going to impact the BIA and DR planning, where third parties now use SLAs and don't have RTO and RPO figures? It's an interesting point. I think probably in this case, when you're looking more at SaaS providers rather than infrastructure as a service providers, the difficulty that you have is often you're limited in what you are actually able to do in terms of the recovery. In many cases, you're at their whims as to when that can be brought back online. So that's certainly a change, and I think this probably, as Chris mentioned earlier, gets into that sort of different territory. I think probably we need to have some separate webinars on the specifics of those points for the actual cloud recovery. But yeah, really interesting points.
I guess, so James, on that very quickly, what strikes me there is you still need to understand what your business needs are, even if the solution to those business needs is a SaaS provider. Doing the analysis in the first place still gives you the understanding of what the risks, the impacts, and the performance that you need, and clearly that will then impact on your choice of software provider. And in some cases, you maybe don't have a great deal of choice, but fundamentally, you still need to understand your business.
Very good. So I'll move on to a slightly different tact here then for Chris. I'll put this to you. So from a non-IT standpoint, who are the key operational teams and persons that you would most closely link to the coordination of an ITDR plan?
Great. Yes, I think I did touch on this as well, but I think I made the point about coordination that's in the question. You cannot be standalone, especially not these days when everyone's everyone's environments are hybrid, and indeed, actually, not just the IT environment is hybrid, but the workforce is hybrid as well. Coordination becomes ever more important. So again, depending on the nature or severity of the disruption, you'll be engaging with the leadership team. They will either be activated or not activated as a crisis team, depending on how severe the disruption is. You'll certainly be keeping them informed as to what's going on, and whether they're activated will depend on whether they feel the need to be leading the organization out of the disaster or the crisis. You will definitely be very closely engaged with two other audiences. One is the BC team, in whatever form they are, incident management, business continuity. They're looking at the overall business response, and sitting alongside that will be your cyber response team as well, who could be external, depending on your arrangements through insurance. If you're suffering a cyber attack that's disrupted your IT, you might find that external digital forensics and incident response experts are brought in to help. So those are your primary internal teams that you'll be engaging with. And then we go back to my pyramid in the third slide. Don't forget your supply chain, especially with SaaS. If you've got this disruption, you're likely to be having to engage at the technology level with those providers and their teams as well. So it's coordination. Tricky to easy to say, tricky to manage, but it's got to be a real focus.
Nice. I've got a couple of points here that are perhaps more observations than questions, but I'll kind of put to you and see what your thoughts are. So first is definitely one that you did cover, perhaps not explicitly, but sort of covered this point, which is business impact analysis. According to the latest ISO 22317:2021 standard, we prioritize services and products, and then activities in the analysis cycle. There's been a shift away from processes. Do we agree?
Yes. Yeah, we do, definitely. And actually, it's not just that's the BIA standard, and it's within the business continuity standards as well. But it also aligns with what's happening in the financial services regulatory space with the operational resilience regulations. They talk about important business services. The latest organizational resilience standard talks about essential outcomes. So yes, we're definitely seeing a shift away from thinking about this from processes and more into a prioritized set of important business services, which are largely focused on the what it is that the company does and the customers that it has. So I'd absolutely agree with that, and I think I reflected that a couple of times in the presentation.
Yeah, and then another here, which again, I know you definitely did hit on, which is it's important to make sure that every time a change is made in the IT infrastructure, the plan is checked to ensure that DR solution interfaces are keeping in step and the DR plan is retested, or at least relevant components impacted by the change. Yeah, you definitely hit that point. That's a definite.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you should really do is make sure that you go into the nuts and bolts of your change management process in your organization and make sure that there's the relevant workflow in there that says trigger, and actually it's not just DR, it should also involve business continuity, but you should have that positive workflow in your change management process that says check the impact on business continuity and disaster recovery plans.
And then another one that's just come through, which I think perhaps in relation to what we've been talking about, but observation, which is kind of leads into what you were mentioning with supply chain management, that DR needs to start at contract negotiation, the supply negotiation stage.
Yes, you can't disagree with that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And actually, you think about that more from a wider business resilience point of view, ties into the point I made about insurance, cyber insurance. I think supply chain resilience is a topic that is of significantly growing interest. But yes, absolutely, make sure that when you're in that contract negotiation stage, you're quite clear on what your expectations are with your supply chain, with suppliers.
Very good. I think I've got one last question, which I'll put to you, and this is see what your answer is to this. So how do you distinguish DR from BCP, from IRP, from COOP, etc., which is excellent, all the acronyms, so many documents, how do they all fit together?
Yes, there are lots of documents. So, again, I talked about business resilience at the start. This is why the overall approach to business resilience needs to be aligned. Because you don't need to have documents that repeat each other. Historically, some people would produce 100-page BC plans for each department, and you don't need that. So what you need to think about is in terms of the outcomes each document is trying to do, and have that sort of hierarchy. So you've got one policy that can cover business resilience and gives pointers for the various bits: crisis management, business continuity, disaster recovery, information security. Make sure that the teams are aligned, so that and also your approach is aligned, so that you're not trying to follow completely different processes, procedures in each type of response. But fundamentally, each of those plans that you listed, or those capabilities that you listed, do address a different part of business resilience. Crisis management is where your organization is dealing with an existential crisis. Business continuity is keeping the business going, whilst disaster recovery, from a technology point of view, is recovering your IT, and of course then you've got the cybersecurity angle as well. So I think it's my fundamental message there would be to be aligned, be holistic, try and make all of your plans as action orientated and as simple to follow as possible. Don't overcomplicate them. Otherwise, people just won't use them. But you're right. There is a lot. There's potentially a lot if you take each one in isolation.
Okay, perfect. In which case, thank you so much, Chris. We'll close things off there. So once again, thanks to everyone for joining us this morning. We will distribute all of the handouts, the recording, the slides, all the links to all the useful resources, and we hope we will see you on our next webinar soon. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, everyone.